Alright, this lesson we're going to jump into After Effects. Now a lot of people overcomplicate After Effects and think it's a very hard program to learn, and it is. When you first jump into it, it can look confusing, and we're working with video, and that's always a bit more confusing than just working on one frame at a time. But if you follow the steps step by step, we'll come up with something that will look nice, and we shouldn't come across too many problems. So when we open up After Effects, it's going to pop up with this little window. All we're going to do is create new project, and it opens up a new project. What I'm going to do for this is I'm going to set my workspace to default, but I'm also going to reset my workspace. So reset workspace to saved layout, and that's going to reset everything for you guys so that you can be a bit more familiar with the workspace and work in the same workspace as I'm working in. Alright, what we can do up here is, this is our project panel. Down here we have our timeline, and up here we have our viewport or our preview. So what I'm going to do in our preview is make a new composition, and we're just going to call this, say, leaves animation. And we're not going to have this 4K, so we can halve that, 1920 by 1080, and we want it at 24 frames, which for 24 frames is standard for most things. We can also go 25 or 30 frames. I'm going to stick to 24. I'm going to keep it to 6 seconds, and the reason behind that is we're going to loop this. So it's going to loop out, and we can export it as a GIF. Let's press OK. And what we popped up with is multiple views, and I don't want this. I don't want all these views. So if it has popped up with 4 views, all we want to do is come down to here, and we have our views, and we can just come down and select one view, and we just want this. And you just use your scroll wheel to zoom in and out in the viewport with your mouse over it. Right, what we want to do is import our leaves here. The easiest way to import is either double click. I don't like this way. Because I've got 2 screens, I just drag in the files. So I'm going to grab our shadow, which we created before under plant shadows, and I'm just going to click and drag it in. Let's bring the other one in. There we go. Bring it in and drop it into the project here. And let's go and drop it in. This image is super large. That's because it's a pixels image, and it's an unsplash image, and it is full resolution. Now what I can do from here is I'm going to come down to my leaves animation, down here into the timeline, and I can right click in the timeline, and I'll bring up these little options here, and I can go new. I'm going to click a solid, and I'm going to come down here. We're just going to leave it as that name. Make sure the size is the same as your document size, so 1920 by 1080. I'm also going to come down here, click on the color, and we're just going to make it really light. Hit OK, press OK, and this is going to act as our background for now. And I can lock that if I want. I'm not going to lock it because I don't need to. Now what we can do is drag our plants in, just click and drag it down over top of here, and you can see a little blue line pops up. If we let go, it'll drag it in over top of this shape. Now what I can do is we can get familiar with keyboard shortcuts. So in each one of these layers, if we hit this little arrow, it twirls down this little menu into transform. And different layers have different menus. So in this case, these 2 layers have only transform, and we only need to look at transform. Later, an effects layer will pop up here, so there'll be an effects layer which we can also twirl down. I want to come down to scale. I'm just going to click here and drag to the left to scale it down. Now we can start rearranging it using these parameters here. So we've got position, scale, and rotation. I'm going to rotate it. So I want it up in this top left corner. I'm going to rotate it a bit, just clicking and dragging to the right and to the left to rotate. Now what I can do is come over to scale. I'm going to scale up a bit, and then I'm going to use my position over here, and I can just click and drag to move it across. Now it's moving across very slowly, so when I click and drag this, I can hold shift and it will move it across in increments of 10 rather than 1 when I'm holding shift. I'm just going to position this up here. So this here is your y-axis and this is your x-axis. We don't have a z-axis because this isn't a 3D file. Now let's scale this up. We'll bring it up in here. Put it up in the top. Somewhere there. Bring it across maybe a bit more. Alright. What I'm going to do is zoom out here. And what we want to do here is add an effect. So I'm going to add an effect here. Up in effects and presets. Come up here. And I'm going to come and search one. So we can search bend. And it's going to be bend it CC. And we're just going to click. And we can drag this onto the shape here. Onto our layer here. We can also drag it down onto this layer here. If we let go. Alright, now that we have dropped the bend it CC onto the shape, or CC bend it, we can change the start and the ending points. And if we click this, we can see that that's the start. We can just click out here to move the start. We want to move the start out to where we want to bend it. Then I'm just going to drag the end, which is the opposite little point. We just drag this way out here. And that's where it's going to bend. So it's going to bend around this point, and it's going to use this as an anchor to bend like so. And if we come over to here to our bend, we can click and drag, and you can see that it's bending. We also have here a little error, and we can use grow bounds for that. We can make that a bit bigger, put that on top, grow bounds, and it just cuts off that edge. So you can see if we don't have grow bounds, it cuts off because it's bending into an area or outside this box. So now that we've added grow bounds, we can start animating. So I'm going to start at 0. And to animate, we use these little stopwatches. And we usually do it down here in the timeline. And I can come down here, let's twirl that transform back up so it's a bit cleaner. And we're just going to put a clock there on bend it, or the bend parameter. Now it adds a little keyframe here. And we're working with 6 seconds. So we might go, we can divide the 6 seconds. We need to divide it into 4. So we're going to add a point here. We're going to add 5. Maybe even a bit more. Let's go 10. No, let's stick to 5. Just keep the movements nice and subtle. And then we're going to go 1, 2. Let's go 2. And change it back to a bend of -5. The opposite. Like so. And then we change it back. The next 2 frames, we change it back to 5. And we may only need 3 keyframes here, so I'm going to select this one by just clicking and dragging over it, and I can just press delete. And now if we play this back, you can see that we have it bending, and it's bending really slowly. Of course, let's select it, let's move all these keyframes back to the start. So what we want to happen is this now to loop out. So to loop out, we have to use a expression, which is a bit of code that tells it to keep looping forever in the timeline. So we need to make sure that the first keyframe is also the same value as the last keyframe. So if we look here, it's 5 on this keyframe. If we go back, we can see it's also 5, which means we can add a loop out expression. Let's hold Alt and click on the stopwatch. Click it on, and we're just going to type loop, loop, and we can go down here and I'll come up with the option tab, and that's what you're going to type, loop out. Now we can close that, and if we watch it back, we've only added 3 keyframes, but now it will loop out. Now if we play this back, you can see that it continues to loop even without keyframes here because we've added an expression. What I will do now is select all the keyframes. I'm going to right click them, go keyframe assist, and add an easy ease to them. And this is going to smooth out the motion so that it looks a lot better. Let's compress these keyframes down to a total of 2 seconds, and that easy ease will still apply. So as you can see, the easy ease still applies, and we're probably going a bit fast. So let's select everything and hold Alt, and we're going to drag it out to 3 frames or 3 seconds. Let's let that run, and this little green bar is rendering it, the red line is where it's rendering at, and it'll pre-render it so that we can view it in full speed. Alright, now we have this motion going back and forth, and it's fairly smooth right now. Like, I'd be pretty happy with that. We can go into the graph editor here, and you can see that it's pretty smoothed out. Everything's nice and smooth, and that means it just continues to flow really nicely. And we just added that. Simply select your keyframes, and they'll look like this when they're easy eased. And just select your keyframes and add the easy ease. Alright, now what I want to do is let's add a tiny bit of rotation to this. So we come back to transform, and we add a bit of rotation to a couple of points. And what I can do is, we're going this way, so let's add a little bit of rotation. First we need to move this anchor point to here. So what we can do is come up here, and we've got this tool here, pan behind anchor point tool. If we select that, we can just click and drag our anchor point. Now we want snapping on, so you just check the snapping here and select both of those, and we just want to click and drag that anchor point till it snaps to that point, and that means I can rotate around that point. Let's go back to our selection tool. Let's move our keyframe to here, and let's just play around. We want it to rotate that way, so we want it to rotate with the direction it's going, and then we want it to rotate back the opposite way. We want that exact same keyframe here as here, so we're just going to select that, Control C, select this, Control V. If we watch it, now we need some easy ease on it. Let's select them all, right click, and add an easy ease. And if we watch it now, alright, so we've easy eased it, and it's added a bit more dynamic movement to it. Let's twirl this back up. Let's click on the layer and press U. That's going to show all our keyframes. I'm going to select these, and we're going to hold Alt once again and drag this out to 5 seconds because I think it needs to be a bit slower. Let's let that render out. like so, and that's our leaves. Look at them. We also want to add a loop out to the rotation. Loop out. Now let's make this whole timeline. Let's come up to here to our project panel and go into our project panel. And we want to edit this. So we're going to right click it, come down to composition settings, come in here, and I want to make this something like 59 seconds or 1 minute. Let's make it 1 minute. So let's turn that into a 0, select this, hit 1, press OK. Now our timeline, let's timeline navigator to the end, drag it out, goes for 1 minute. Now all I want to do here, select these two, or just this layer I guess, and drag it all the way to the end. This layer is going to be turned off. We could also drag it to the end if we wanted to. Now what's going to happen is it's still going to loop out all the way down here because of our expression, even though we don't have keyframes copy and pasted all the way down there. So it's going to continue to loop out. Now what we can do is export this. Let's go Control S to save the document first. Let's save it in an appropriate place. Leaves animation. Let's go OK. Alright, we want to render this out. I'm going to render in two versions. We're not going to do GIF because GIF in 1920 by 1080 pixels is going to be massive. So what I'm going to do is come down to, we want to add one to the render queue, and we can just leave the white on. And what I'm going to do is come down here, and maybe when we add this one to the render queue, we can come down and go RGB plus alpha. So what I can do is come back into my leaves animation, turn off this white layer, and if we toggle this, this is the transparency grid, so we can see what's transparent by the little grid in the background. Come back to our render queue. What we can do now is come into lossless, AVI, we want an RGB plus alpha, and alpha is a transparent layer. So let's select that. Let's press OK. We don't need an audio output. Let's turn that off. Press OK. Let's change our output. Let's leave it in here, and we're going to call this V1. Let's press save. And then we can just hit render. That'll render it out. It'll export it into the appropriate spot. Now one thing is, AVI files with a transparent background are ginormous, and on Windows I cannot use QuickTime files which are slightly smaller. So what we can do instead is keep the white background and just add a blending mode later, but it needs to be a pure white background. And then we can add it to a queue and then render it in Media Encoder. And I will show you that after this has finished rendering. Alright, now that the render has finished, it took 21 minutes to render, so it's a very long time to render a 1 minute clip. It's because of that transparent layer. I'm going to turn that solid back on. I'm going to come to File, down to Export, and then we're going to add it to the Media Encoder queue. That's going to open another piece of software, which is called Media Encoder. Now this software just primarily encodes media basically. So you can send a work from Premiere Pro and After Effects here, and you can queue up a heap of renders and then export them all at once. So we'll wait for that to open. This should automatically be installed when you install either Premiere Pro or After Effects. I'm pretty sure it installs when you install After Effects. I'm not sure whether it installs when you install Premiere Pro. Now what's going to happen is it'll pop up in here in the queue. Let's go Window, Workspace, Revert, just so that I've got the same workspace. And here we go, we have opened it up into the media encoder. What I'm going to do is leave it as H.264. Make sure we have the white background in our document. Yep. Change the output file. And we're just going to change it to AE files, leaves, white BG. Save. And we'll press play. And so the other one took 21 minutes to render. Once this has linked up, it'll be much faster than the AVI file, because H.264 is a fairly compressed file, and it also doesn't have an alpha layer. So it should be much faster, but we'll leave that to render. Alright, so this render may take as long as the last one, and the reason behind this is because of our high bit depth. Now bit depth is our color, so over here we have a 32-bit depth, which is absolutely massive. So what I'm going to do is pause. I'm going to come over to here, and I'm going to change this back to 8. So it's color, let's change this to 8, hit OK. Let's now go back and export this. We want to add it to the render queue. Let's select our composition, export, add to render queue. And what I want to do is change that location. We want to export it into here, white BG. And what I'm going to do is just name this V1. And let's right click this one, and we're gonna let's stop the render. Let's remove this from the queue, and let's render this one, and we'll see if it's much faster. It may not be, but there we go. We're moving much faster because of the way lower bit depth. And bit depth can be important for this, not so much. If we're using major gradients and gradients everywhere, we might see banding inside the gradients, and that's when we can up the bit depth. We usually don't go all the way up to 32, that's massive. We can stick to 16, or if you need to, go to 32. Sometimes if someone's got a way quicker computer, it's much easier to render 32-bit. Let's wait for that to render. Alright, this has absolutely shot off, and it's going flat out because of the loop out. So once it rendered that little bit of the keyframes, it noticed that the rest of it was a loop out, and that it had already rendered it. So it just copied and pasted the render all the way through and rendered it flat out. Alright, in the next lesson, we're going to stick this image over top of our mock-up. Let's go do that.